It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Donal McCracken. Donal is a emeritus professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he has been for some 40 years. Prior to that, he finishes a DPhil at the University of Ulster on the impacts of developments in South Africa on Irish politics. And his career is really one that goes back and forth between looking at the history of Ireland and the Irish in South Africa, as well as a completely separate area looking at a botanical history. And on these topics, he has been incredibly productive and prolific with 18 books, I believe, on varied topics, including the one he'll be talking to us tonight. So that is on Napoleon's Garden Island, Lost and Old Gardens of St Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. So as we're started a bit late, I think I will just go ahead and hand over to Donal to start his presentation.
Donal, you're on mute.
Is that okay?
That's great.
Okay, now all I have to do is learn how to do the slides. Yeah. Sorry. Right, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I thought we were going to have load shedding, but we haven't, so we're back on track. Thank you to the Linnean Society for inviting me to speak to them. I'm speaking about gardens of the island of St Helena, which is in the South Atlantic. And recently, Kew Gardens published a book on that subject, which I'd written. And I'm very grateful to them, to Gina Fullerlove and Lydia White for taking the manuscript. We academics, we're always greatly relieved when our manuscripts are accepted, our unpublishable manuscripts. I first got to St Helena really by accident. Patricia, who actually edits the South African Botanical Society's magazine, Felt and Flora, was named some years ago South African Journalist of the Year. And the prize turned out to be a trip anywhere in the world, and she could take her husband with her. And there was lots of family disputes about where one would go, whether one would go to the teak forests of South Asia or to the Galapagos Islands or wherever. And in the end, we decided we would go to St Helena. At that time, of course, there was no flights in. The airport was only finally constructed in 2017. So the only way to get to St Helena was by ship, or the Royal Mail ship. And it took 4 days to get there out of Walvis Bay and 4 days to get back. So whilst Patricia sat at the captain's table eating delicacies, I was below deck being seasick. A most unpleasant trip there, but an even worse one back. And it just showed me why St Helena was chosen as the place where it was by the East India Company. The trade winds sweep up the coast of Africa, taking with them the ships. And it's always much more difficult to come down against the trade winds. Anyway, I survived. And I'm glad I did, because whilst when you approach the island of St Helena, like in the slide, it looks very dark and foreboding, what Napoleon referred to as the Rock. Nonetheless, it is an extraordinary place. I have two criteria basically for leaving home. One is that there must be botanic gardens, and secondly, there must be an archive. And St Helena seemed to tick those boxes. The archive is in the basement of the castle, which is just inside the defense barrier that's across the head of the valley, the St. Jamestown Valley. And it's a long, thin little room, and I spent quite a lot of time there working on this book. I put up this map of St Helena because it used to appear in the old British reports in the 1890s on an annual basis. It's not the best map. The best map, in my opinion, is the British Admiralty map of 1922, because it marks out all the old houses, the properties, the paths and the roads. And I bought a copy and photographed it so I can blow it up. And it by far is much superior to this one. But this one suffices because it lays out the so-called vegetation zones, falling into 3. Now, I know the botanists nowadays will question this, but from our point of view, I think it will suffice. You've got the central ridge there, Diana's Peak, as they call it, which still the clouds come down, so it's sort of misspelt type rainforest, if you want to call it that. Then below that, you've got the lower ground where most of the agriculture, what there is in the way of agriculture on St Helena. And then beyond it, you've got the periphery, much degraded, starting with because of the introduction of goats, which were a dreadful menace on the island for well over 150 years. The vegetation, the indigenous vegetation has been decimated. And in the book, St Helena is very fortunate in that it has had a series of local historians, but also a series of botanists that have devoted themselves to the study of its history, to its botany, remembering that the island is only 10 miles by 5 miles in extent. It's only the size of Guernsey Island. So it is a very small area. It gives the impression of being much larger because of the volcanic nature of the island. So these great troughs and dips and peaks and what have you. So you think it's much bigger when you're actually there than it actually is. But it had this endemic flora, quite extraordinary flora. Nowadays, it's been estimated that there are 56 species of endemic plants, although the number sort of oscillates depending on whether you're splitting or lumping or whatever. 6 are extinct in cultivation, in the wild, and I'll read that again. This is from the book. There are 56 species of endemic plants on St Helena. 6 are extinct both in cultivation and in the wild, and a further 2 are extinct in the wild, but exist precariously under cultivation. Of the 48 endemic species surviving in the wild, Lambton and Cronk, and those are Quinton Cronk was the man really who started modern botany in the island. His legacy is an extraordinary one, and Phil Lambton has produced the flora, the modern flora of St Helena, which is a must if anyone is interested in the plants of not only the indigenous plants, but also the exotic plants as well. So you have the small number of plants confined to pockets in various parts of the island. Of the 48 endemic species surviving in the wild, these 2 authors cite endemic plant abundance and distribution record, which records 7 plant species are locally common, 7 as endangered, 9 as vulnerable, 29 as critical, and 2 are not threatened. And the Kew Millennium Seed Bank holds 42 of the endemic species of the island. But really, the vast majority of the land, over 96% of it, is filled with exotics. And there's no way that you can get around that. If you look at this, and it is very, how reliable, you can debate about it, but broadly speaking, it is reliable. In 1875, it was estimated that about 50% was what's called barren land. Now, plants obviously did grow theirs. Then indifferent crown pasture, 22nd, but only 26% was regarded as really being able to have any form of agriculture on it at all. And then the remaining 2% was forest trees, cultivation as distinct from pasture, orchard and gardens. And you can see that today when you go round the place. These funny little roads. When I went to St Helena first, everyone said, "Oh, it's like Surrey. It's like Surrey." And we arrived and we hired this battered old car and started driving around. And I must admit, the first thing we said was, "It's like KwaZulu-Natal. It's like KwaZulu-Natal," because the country lanes were lined with erythema trees, and in the ditches were the arum lilies. But of course, both statements are wrong, as you'll see. You have the arid side, where a lot of the indigenous flora were stripped either by animals or by people. It was used for the lime works that were done in Sandy Bay. It was used for tanning. It was used for firewood, for fuel, and it was used to a certain degree for building. One of the problems in St Helena as the 19th century progressed was the fact that there was a beetle, a borer beetle, that got into the houses, into the wood. Now, we here in Durban have the same problem. This old house I'm living in at the moment is being eaten by borer. I sometimes wonder whether I'll survive it or the house which will go first. But anyway, they started eating the rafters of the house. So you actually find these wonderful old Georgian houses. They change their shape, or the roofs change their shape as you go along through time. They start off as thatched, then they become slate with wooden rafters and beams. And then when the borer beetle gets in and the houses start collapsing, then they have to use iron and metal sheeting. So it's quite an interesting development. But even amongst this vast quantity of exotics, and I'll talk about the exotics in a few minutes' time, you have these treasures, these indigenous, these endemic treasures. And you go down to Sandy Bay. We were there last time we were there, because the next time we went, the airport had arrived, and within 2 weeks of it, Patricia and Donal were on a flight. I wasn't going on that ship anymore. Even down in Sandy Bay, you've got in amongst all the desolation and what have you, you've treasures like this, the so-called baby's toes, the wonderful plant growing in the greatest profusion on little more than basalt grit, nearly basalt sand. And then to the other extreme, when you go up onto the ridge, you get this very lush flora cascading over the side with pockets of the indigenous flora amongst it. How on earth an araucaria got to be on the peak there, I do not know. I really do not know. Diana's Peak, 2,600 feet above sea level, 800 meters above sea level. But there are these pockets of vegetation that you get on the island, and which are very, very special of the local flora. And when we were there, we were very lucky to be shown around by a man named George Benjamin that Quentin Cronk had teamed up with in the earlier days, and unfortunately he's no longer with us. And he showed us this area, the cabbage trees and the wild ferns and what have you. There has been attempts to reclaim areas. This is the Millennium Forest, which was started in 2012 with planting trees there. I don't know what happens when you plant trees and they're all the same age and they all grow up, but what can you do? What is the alternative? Tens of thousands of indigenous trees have been planted there. I rather like this photograph because it shows you the intimacy of and the richness of St Helena. This is looking down and from the lush areas of the highlands, and there's a lovely St Helena tree fern on your left, to the middle ground, and you'll see one of the old plantation houses down there on the ridges where the agriculture was, to the extent there was any agriculture, and then further down you've got the more arid region, all squashed into a relatively small area. I remember reading something somewhere about someone telling me, or someone writing how difficult it was if you were out hunting on St Helena. Not that there was very much to hunt. A couple of partridges would be about it, because the birds only had to fly a couple of 100 feet to the next ridge, and you had to go down the valley and then up the valley, and by the time you got up, the birds had fled. But even amongst the indigenous flora, you've got the exotics, and some very exotics. I mean, I had to do a double take when I saw this on the ridge, and said, surely not, but yes, surely it was. Cinchona. St Helena has suffered, if that's the right word, over the centuries by governments that have had a great scheme to save the island. And on one, they were going to plant hundreds of trees so that they could, mulberry trees, so that they could have a silk industry, and the silk industry would save the island. And then in the 1860s, and Kew was behind us, they actually sent a gardener out. And all went fine until another governor took over. And as was the case very often in empire, it all depended on the personality of the person who was running the show. And he didn't think much of this, and the thing was left to rack and ruin. But still, and that was the 1860s, still by the 2020s, you still have these occasional rather weedy looking cinchona plants pushing up amongst the indigenous ferns. A lot of the plants that are exotic were brought in deliberately as what were called economics. In other words, plants that were going to help the island and make the island prosperous. And in the book, I put a list there of the various plants and the so-called dates of when they were introduced. How accurate those dates are, I don't know. I'm rather dubious, or rather, I'm rather dubious of whether when you put a date, that is actually the date from which the plant grew continuously through to the present. Take, for instance, St Helena coffee, which is very valuable. As you know, it is the most expensive coffee in the world. Very good coffee it is. And Napoleon liked St Helena coffee. And I tell you, Napoleon didn't like an awful lot about St Helena, perhaps with reason. But, you get these dates, 1829 or 1729 or 1733 or whatever it might be. And then you've got great gaps where you never find any account or mention of coffee growing. And then suddenly it'll appear again. So you have this multi-introduction of these economic species coming along. And some of them vanish from the face of the earth and are never seen again. And some of them become invasives and a damn curse. Okay, the gardens. The earliest gardens on the island of St Helena were those that were established by the Dutch East India Company. The East India Company get their paws on the island in what is it, 1651. They get a charter in 1661. The Dutch drive them out for a year in the 1670s, and then they're there right the way through until they cease running the island in the 1830s. And they established a garden. And if you climb up Jacob's ladder there, 699 steps, although someone on Saturday was telling me there are actually 700 because there's a bottom step that's missing. Whether that is true, I don't know. You can see there in this photograph, not very good photograph, taken looking down from the top of Jacob's ladder, and you see the wonderful town of Jamestown with its gorgeous Georgian houses fronting the main street. And you can see there the military divide that cuts off the valley from the sea, and there's a portcullis and everything that you have to go through, and a wall that you can walk around. In fact, that used to be used as a promenade wall for the ladies and gentlemen, the officers and ladies in the Napoleonic period. If you just move up slightly, you get to what is called now the Castle Gardens, and what used to be called the Company Gardens. And if you look back to the early 18th century, we find this sketch map. And I know people say it's all dreadfully inaccurate and what have you, which it might be so, but it's not so inaccurate that it doesn't say the fundamentals. You've got your two streams coming down, one on either side. and water, of course, for the provision of these East India men as they came through. And remember, St Helena was kept by the East India Company as a stopping off port, as a place for replenishment for these great fleets, enormous fleets, hundreds of ships that twice a year moved. There was the China fleet coming in, sweeping across the Indian Ocean and round the Cape without stopping at the Cape, and then right the way up the South Atlantic to St Helena. And then there was the South Asian fleet from Indonesia, from South India, where have you, it coming round. And of course, very prosperous time of year for the inhabitants of Jamestown and the local gentry, if gentry they can be called. When they did come, you could make more money in those 2 weeks than you could make for the rest of the year. You have this situation where you've got the valley, where you've got a castle, basically in the middle of it, and then to the side of it, as you'll see there, you've got going up the side of the valley, you've got this enormous garden. But of course, it wasn't a pleasure park. What is there laid out all in its fancy ways is rubbish. It basically was a vegetable patch and an area where you could grow lemon trees, which was what was required by the passing fleets. And it wasn't unique. The Dutch had these gardens. They had them in the east and they had them in Cape Town. And there it is up the side. You can see the Star Fort there on the left. If you go over to the right, behind the kirk, you'll find a very similar garden with exactly the same purpose as that on St Helena. Now, these gardens became a stopping off point, but they became a stopping off point not only for the crew to find their land legs again and get a drink of water and maybe some arrack, the potato spirit, the dreadful spirit, the sort of poignant of the island, but also the plants. And very often they unloaded plants that they brought from the east, from China, from India, where have you, and they replanted them in this gardens. And that is why so many of the plants, it really is an international botanic garden, St Helena, at the moment. That is why so many of these plants are from the east. They're from China, they're from India and Indonesia and where have you. And of course, you've got the visit of Captain Bligh. Everyone knows about the mutiny in the Bounty. I don't know that many people know that the first thing that the mutineers did when they seized the ship was throw all the breadfruit plants into the water, and they were bobbing up and down before they sank. What isn't also known is that Bligh went back after he got home eventually. The only one who died in that ship was the poor old botanist. It was very, very sad. And he came back to the South Pacific, loaded up 2 more ships with breadfruit and brought them back. And he brought them back via St Helena, and he donated 500 of them to St Helena, and they were taken and they were planted in that gardens. I may say I can find no trace of them ever after, so I'm afraid they died. By the time Napoleon comes along, that garden is not an economic garden anymore, it's a pleasure garden. And you can see this is 1815, this stylized, rather nice stylized print of Jamestown. With its church, and it hasn't got its spire. The spire comes and goes in the history of Jamestown, but it is a pleasure garden. And there's a photograph of it in 1910, looking down from the side of the hill, and you can see all that is left is basically what is left now of what they call the Castle Garden. If you move up the valley, however, there were 2 further gardens in the only town that there was on the island. One of them was in private hands. This is the one you can see right up here at the top on the left, Maldivia or Concord, which was owned by the Hudson family and then by the Bennett family. And incidentally, Colin Fox, the historian of St Helena, has done a very good book on the Bennets of St Helena. He's also done a very good book on enslaved peoples on the island. So that was one, and you can see the garden is laid out properly. You know, there's time and thought and money gone into that. And then further down the valley, beyond, you can see the quarry there on the side on the right. Behind, further down, there was the Botanic Garden. Now, the Botanic Gardens was a remarkable institution to establish in 1787. That was the year that Calcutta Botanic Gardens was established. St Vincent had a Botanic Gardens in 1765. So St Vincent's is an older island garden, but not much of an older island garden. We don't really know what was grown in the gardens because there are no printed catalogue. It's not like Durban Botanic Gardens where you can, you can get a Medley Wood and Mark McKin and all those guys did annual reports and they printed things out. We don't have that. All we have are some manuscript lists. The first being 1789, and these are in the East India Company Garden records, which is in the British Library. And this is the first page, and you can see it, the company, the New Botanic Gardens, and it lists the plants there, and it lists it in 2 other gardens that the company ran, and it had its own garden. It had its own superintendent of gardens. I won't say he was a scoundrel, but he was out to make a little bit of money on the side if he could. When Napoleon first landed on St Helena, the house he stayed on was owned by the gardener. Porteous, Henry Porteous, and it was a big house beside the castle garden, but he divided it up into tiny little rooms, and Napoleon had to sleep in one of these tiny little rooms, and he divided it up in tiny little rooms because the more rooms he had, the more people he could get in, and the more people he could get in, the more money he could make. But he also ran the gardens in the Botanic Gardens in the early years, and did a relatively good job of it. So we know in 1789 there were 120 species growing there, and in the book, I list the names. Of course, historic names and modern names are a major problem, and the temptation is always to translate to the modern, but you can never be quite sure about what was there then is in actual fact what the plant became later. So I've just left well alone and left the names as they were. 1792, we have another list, and then there was the only time we had a proper botanist running the St Helena Botanic Gardens in 1806 to 1810. Interestingly enough, this Botanic Gardens did have some indigenous plants. This list at the bottom of it, and it's nearly torn off. I was actually so glad that I found it, because it was one of those sort of grubby little bits of paper at the end of a document that, one day it's going to fall off and it's going to go on the ground, and then it's going to go into it needs preservation. They had whitewood, they had redwood, they had cabbage tree, they had tree ferns, and they had gumwood. And underneath it, Porteous had written, "These are indigenous and do not appear to have been described by Linnaeus." That Botanic Gardens was down the side of, on one side of the road, down the side of the valley. And it was a great construction work because it was built on 2 levels. And there's a dividing wall between that goes down that divides those 2 levels. And they brought troops in. They used punishment troops. In other words, soldiers that had gotten into trouble were told, either you can have so many lashes, and I tell you, things were brutal. Things were absolutely brutal in St Helena. There is a book by one of the governors called Janisch, called St Helena Records, and it's from the early 17th century through until the end of the 18th century. And in this, time and time again, he's talking about 200 lashes here, 150 lashes there, 40 lashes here. I mean, 200 lashes would kill you. And these troops, instead of getting lashes, were put in for basically forced labor to move soil and create this Botanic Gardens. And this is a sketch about 1808 that we have. An interesting one, it's in Kew, an interesting one because the plants you can identify, they're written in pencil beside them. So it's very useful. The only photograph I've ever come of the St Helena Botanic Gardens is this one, which really is a photograph which was taken of the military parade ground and the quarters. This is about 1880. But then in the front of the picture, you can see there the layout of the paths. You can see a water tank there beside the entrance gate. Then you can see the water run down on the right there. There is a map dating in the 1830s, which shows the gardens, and you can see the ladder going down, the staircase going down from one level of the gardens to the other. And that's what's left today. That's me standing under an ice-old Indian fig. But you can see the wall, the retaining wall between the upper gardens and the lower gardens. And if you look just to my right there, you'll see the staircase coming down. And where the gardens was where I'm standing, but also where that block of flats is. And I don't know, ironically, they're calling it Botanic Gardens, but how appropriate that is, I don't know. And that's the far side of the block of flats where you can see the run, the water run that occasionally came down in flood and washed everything away. And that's the wall of the old Botanic Gardens from the outside. The part of the old wall has remained. It's all very sad. There is nothing more sad than the remnants of a dead garden. Now, the garden thrived mainly because of a series of relatively enlightened, I use the word relatively because, you know, it is relative, that were in charge of the island. The old military governors, the army officers who were rough and tough, the 17th century army, they were rough and tough, brutal, to keep law and order, because revolts by enslaved people on the island, because it was a slave island, were relatively common. But more common was mutinies amongst the troops who were treated nearly as bad. And even in this period of so-called Enlightenment, you have in 1811 you have a major army revolt. So you've got Colonel Robert Brooke. I'm proud to say was an Irishman. He came from the County Cavan. I once got into dreadful trouble for saying that the village he came from, Murloch, was more remote than was St Helena, and in a fashion it was. But I can't say that, and I certainly couldn't say it this evening. Robert Brooke was a businessman. He'd been a soldier out in India. He'd come back. He'd been a businessman. He'd gone bankrupt, and basically to make some money, he accepted being governor of St Helena, and it was probably the best thing ever happened to St Helena. A very civilized man. Now he was succeeded by a man named Patton, who was equally sympathetic towards plants and nature. And then there was Colonel Beatson, who was more of a horticulturalist in the later period. And these governors lived inland in a house called Plantation House. Here's a sketch of Plantation House in the 1870s. It's surrounded by a very large wall, high wall. The wall is reinforced, as you can see, but notice the elegant garden that there is up there to the right under the country church. The old house is rebuilt, but where's the garden? Well, the garden has moved, which often happened in great houses. And it's something that I've actually never read about, anyone write about, how a garden will move from one place to another place as the centuries progress. This is sort of 1820-ish. You can see the experimental plots that Beatson, the governor, had in front of the house. And then to the right, you'll see that there's a formal garden down there. And the lovely thing about this illustration is that you can see two of the gardeners. And they are indentured people from China, that were brought in from China. They were professional gardeners, and you can see that their house down there on the left. There weren't vast numbers of gardeners on St Helena, although there were quite a lot of gardens, because you had these public gardens or company gardens, and then you had the private estates, which had their little gardens, which I'll talk to you about in a few seconds. They tended to be an arboretum rather than a flower garden. They had shrubs, they had trees. So once you had established it, you really didn't need an awful lot of gardeners. And Colin Fox in his book has listed, and he allowed me to reproduce the names of the different people that were gardeners at various times. Some of them were enslaved people, and some of them were indentured people. Now, I suppose the difference is with an indenture that at the end of your indention, in theory, you can go back to wherever it was. In practice, it didn't really work terribly well. And then there were occasionally one or two white gardeners as well. And in one case, more than one case, the curator actually doing half the work himself. Now, these enslaved people and these indentured people when they didn't live in town, they lived in these rather miserable little block houses that were scattered across the island. But the lovely thing is that occasionally you come on an account, a description of these little cottages and the neat little flower beds that were around them, which I always thought said something about the spirit of life and humanity. The botanist of St Helena is Burchell, is William Burchell, 25 years old, an insecure young man, starting off on his great adventure, making his name later on in the Cape. Burchell is the man. Now the books talk about Banks and Solander and Cook and Roxburgh, who did do a list of plants, and Darwin and Hooker. And I was going to put a picture of them all up, and then I thought, no. Their accounts are quite interesting and useful, but Burchell is the botanist of St Helena, and he has left his diaries, and he's left his collecting books, and he's left his notebooks, and he's left sketches that he made, like the one on the right there, sketches that he made of St Helena, because he was planning to do a book on St Helena, and it is a dreadful pity, like he did on South Africa. It's a grateful pity that he never did the book. I think one of the reasons was that he had a bad time just when he arrived. He was engaged, and the fiancée turned up from England behind him in a different ship, and announced to him that she decided she wouldn't marry him, and that she was going to marry the ship's captain that she'd come out on the boat with, and the two of them sailed off to India. And not surprisingly, the fellow was a bit gloomy after that. The governor looked after him, but he had a short fuse, did old Burchell, and he had a tendency to fight and quarrel with people unnecessarily. But you cannot take away from the fact that as a botanist, he was grade one. He was the goods, and the papers are in Kew. After he died, they were donated by the sister who actually went through his diaries with a pair of scissors, cutting out the bits that she didn't like, in particular about the girlfriend that had dropped him. Now you get something like this in the Burchell papers, which I find very useful but very difficult to deal with. They're lists of plants that he finds when he's out exploring and where he found them. And what I did was I worked through these sheets and pulled out the gardens. And on that sheet that you see, you've got West Lodge, you've got Botanic Gardens, you've got Plantation House, you've Longwood, you've got Prospect, you've got Forest Lodge, you've got the Dovetons, you've got about a dozen just in that one page. So it was a very, very useful source. And then analyzing them according to the number of species that Burchell lists. And then I couldn't resist putting that picture in of Burchell and his little dog. I think that little dog had a big task to keep his master well under on the straight and narrow. My poor little faithful dog, he described the dog of. That's sitting up under Alarm Cottage, looking down, and you can see Jamestown in the distance, and then in the middle distance you see his workers. You see enslaved people that were employed in the gardens. I suppose you can't talk about gardening and St Helena without mentioning Napoleon. Napoleon, was the great general, the great emperor, the ruler of the world, but he was also a man who was passionate about plants. He was also passionate about Josephine. And Josephine, of course, although he had divorced her, but not because he didn't like her, because of dynastic reasons, had got Malmaison and all that went on there. And remember, after Waterloo, the place that Napoleon went to when he'd been defeated was to walk in Malmaison. He walked and he read novels in Malmaison for 2 weeks, and he closed off the world before the world caught up with him, and he was banished to the Rock. He was meant to go, or he thought he was going to go to Plantation House. The governor in charge of Plantation House, a man named Lowe, wasn't a particularly diplomatic fellow. He wasn't the best of, I'm afraid he was an Irishman too. he wasn't the most ideal character to deal with a very difficult situation. He was completely undiplomatic. He was petty, and Mrs. Lowe certainly wasn't going to have him living in her house. So that map, lovely old map of the time, says residence of Bonaparte, but it's not a residence of Bonaparte. It's the residence of Governor Lowe. But above the house, you'll see there it says Botanic Gardens. So the garden has now moved from the front of the house, from the side of the house to the other side of the house, now to the back of the house. Napoleon, having been one day in Jamestown, obviously goes to the Briars, where William Balcombe, who is another fellow who's a bit on the edge of respectability, lived, and of course Napoleon is in the summer house. This sketch is beautiful, but the summer house is elevated a little bit too much. But he loved the garden there. He was there from the 10th of October 1815 until the 10th of December 1815, when they moved him into Longwood. Longwood was pretty disastrous. It was the house for the assistant governor. The roof was basically made of paper mache. The place was infested by rats. The rooms were small. Napoleon's bedroom was about the length of this room that I'm in here, and he found relief, and he found escapism in establishing a garden. And the present honorary consul on St Helena has done a marvelous job in trying to re-establish the garden. Now, we don't know exactly what was growing in the garden. Monsieur Martineau, the consul. And he established this wonderful little garden that only lasted as long as he lived, because as soon as he died, they plowed it up and started growing potatoes. So there is Napoleon speaking to one of the gardeners, a chap called Toby. They're rebuilding his cottage at the moment. The British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust are rebuilding the cottage, which is a very valuable thing and sensible thing to do, and has a proper educational purpose to it. He would like to have freedom, but get Tobias freedom, but it didn't happen. And he physically set to and gardened himself, and he got what was to the horror of his courtiers that were there, he got them to garden too. And he had indentured Chinese laborers who gardened, and occasionally got a bottle of wine from him, Cape wine from him. And it's a story in its own right, and it's a very sad little story. Basically, Napoleon used his garden as a salon, as a meeting place, because the house itself was such a poky little place. You couldn't take people in there, but the garden had some style, and we know some of the plants that may have been there because there are lists of plants that were sent from the Cape to St Helena at this time by a Frenchman called Villette, who had a natural a business in Cape Town, and he sold plants. And I haven't got the time to go into the detail now about what was sent, but all you would expect, the ericas and the stapelias and the proteas, geraniums, the pelargoniums, all those plants are on these lists that have been sent from the Cape to the island at the time. We know the layout because Montholon, the Count Montholon, who was a long-suffering courtier, a great deal of time from him for him, left us a map of how it was. The two small gardens, the house is the T there, the two small gardens, and then this larger garden with its famous earth banks, with its pond and the fish that died, that distressed Napoleon so much, and the Chinese bird house, the birds died too, and the walkways and what have you. We know when Napoleon was in his garden because the British had spies, and they recorded every day. The orderly made notes of when he was seen in the gardens. And what I did was I noted the number of times every month that Napoleon was seen in the gardens. And then he wrote what was, Napoleon said, Sergeant David acquainted me that he had seen General B. They called him General, not Emperor, as a petty little insult. At between 9 and 10 o'clock, Count Montholon informed me that General B was walking in the little garden. I immediately went round the house, but he had gone in. All cat and mouse games. When he died, he was buried. He wanted to be buried in Paris. They wouldn't let it. He was buried at a site where there was a spring, and he liked the sweet water that they got there. A little arboretum grew up around it with the willow tree. The willow tree became something that people stole branches of, souvenirs. A part of it was taken back to Kew. Here's Kew's accession books. You can see John Smith, the curator in 1820, saying in 1827 that they've got a Napoleon willow. And there were scoundrel nurserymen in London that were selling Napoleon willows as a separate species in its own right. Of course, they weren't separate species in their own right. That then brings us to the private houses. And Mellis, now, one of the great books of St Helena, I know it's got inaccuracies and all that, is the volume that was written by John Charles Mellis, St Helena, a physical, historical, and topographical description of the island, including its geology, fauna, flora, and meteorology. And in that, this wonderful book, he lists the plants, and he lists where they got the plants. So you can make this graph and say, so many plants, 47% of the plants in Mellis are in the wild, then 32% are in gardens, and 21% are in unnamed gardens. In other words, over 50% of the plants that Mellis lists, the interesting plants, are in gardens. So gardens have a role, and an important role. And they weren't landed. They regarded themselves as gentry and landed estate, but they weren't. They were like County Antrim farmhouses. And you can't really see it, but there are 5 of them in this picture alone. This is 1784. And then, interestingly enough, you get the cultivated area and the places where the sheep are reared. And then up on the hills, here on the left of the picture, you'll see the indigenous flora. The layout of these gardens tended to be the same. You had a piece of pasture in front of the house. This is Rosemary Hall. You then had 2 lines of trees on either side, and then you had the arboretum behind with a shrubbery as well. And it repeats itself. This is Fairyland, which is the house I would love to have, sadly it's no more, I would love to have owned if I'd lived in the 19th century in St Helena. But you can see there the trees behind, the open space in front. That's the basalt pillar in front. Colonel Doveton's, Sir William's house down in Sandy Bay, Doveton's house in Sandy Bay, the same again, the arboretum behind. You sometimes get different, very rarely you get different. This is, where is this? Knoll, High Knoll, that's right. Where there aren't so many plants. There's some there at the side there. There's a stone pine growing just behind it there. You can see what a stone pine's doing in the South Atlantic, I don't know. And then you can see down in the watercourse, there are the yams that were used to feed the enslaved population. The greatest of St Helena's houses was Oakbank, home of the Hudsons and then the Mellises. And you can see that it has an enormous arboretum. It's a different league. Prospect, where Thomas Brooke, nephew of the old governor, yet again, the shrubbery, the plantation behind the house. A couple of slides just to show that there was some street planting in St Helena. Under the tree, the famous auctions for enslaved people. And they still have trees there. There was one there. That was a people tree, the Indian tree, and then further down there was another. I like this picture because it was on a stamp, a St Helena stamp, and it was on a postcard. And in both cases, the most important thing was left out or airbrushed out, and that is down there on the left. And your eye goes to the 2 lovely ships, but in actual fact, what you should be looking at is the tree, because you can see the effort that has gone into making sure that tree is safe. It's a people tree. and it's been staked and it's been surrounded so that people won't knock it down. And I tell you, that tree is still there today. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong to St Helena? The Botanic Gardens went to rack and ruin. They were sent out to rent, and that's not good for any gardens. The coming of the Suez Canal, the number of steamships not stopping because they didn't have to stop for replenishment, and the number of ships going downhill. You can see there from about 1,000 a year ship right the way down to very few at the end of the period. The garrison withdrew. The garrison money, spending money on the island. It's big at the end because you've got the Boer War prisoner camp, but otherwise it's out the window. And yet some of these gentry, with all their faults, were interested in botany and wrote back to Kew. There's a lovely letter here, which is a little map of High Ridge, numbering where certain of the endemic species were. And plates of the indigenous species start being reproduced overseas in the 19th century. Things might have been saved. Well, I don't know that they could have been saved had this man got his way. Daniel Morris, a remarkable man, director of the Botanic Gardens in Peradeniya in Sri Lanka, later in charge of Botanic Gardens in the West Indies, I hear my clock chime, so I must wind up. And he came to St Helena, wrote a report in 1886, and they didn't publish it. It was only 20 years later, in 1906, that his report on the agricultural resources of the island of St Helena was published. But by then, New Zealand flax was the answer. Again, one thing, an answer, and the whole island planted over with New Zealand flax, which it's still suffering from today. The old castle garden was turned into a prisoner of war camp, and there's nothing to destroy a garden than making it a prisoner of war camp, I can assure you. There's the fountain, which still exists today. The dog is gone, but the fountain is there. And the old houses themselves, with no income, with no military, with no naval, they go to rack and ruin. And this picture is just so evocative of what happened. I think this is Bamboo Hedge House down in Sandy Bay there. There's a flax mill there where there used to be the garden. Half the arboretum's gone. There are donkeys and cows wandering through, and the old house itself is in rack and ruin. There has been some attempt in recent years to restore the old houses, and that's much to the credit of the St Helenans, the saints, as they're called. Teutonic Hall, someone told me 2 days ago that old Rufkins has been rebuilt, and the more that happens, the better, and the better it'll be for the soul of the island, but also for the tourist income of the island. And remember, this is an island which has everything. It's got architecture, it's got military history, it's got naval history, it's got ocean life, it's got bird life, it's got plant life. It's steeped in history. It is the place to go. And Kew published my book, and I'm very grateful to them. And they tell me that there's an offer this evening. If you buy it online at the Kew bookshop, you get £5 off. That cover is, you can see why Sir Joseph Banks called it the trench. It's exaggerated, of course, but it's a lovely, it's 18, what date is it? 1821, this print of Jamestown. And what is lovely is you can see the indigenous flora falling off the cliffs there, as it used to be, and still is to a certain extent, but there's a lot of work to be done. And the zigzag roads all the way up. You try to go up some of those roads and there's a car coming down fast, you're in great trouble. Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll leave it at that.
Donal, Anjali, if you...
I'm unmuted myself. Thank you. That was fantastic. There's a lot of ground to cover with that presentation. And we have, understandably, quite a lot of questions from the audience. And so I'll just run through these. So you did speak about Napoleon's willows when you first started talking about Napoleon. So I will consider that answer that question answered. It just said
There's
to say anything.
there's also a Napoleon fern, but it's a little bit more legitimate. It's under at the base of the ridge, the central ridge.
Okay. Question from Kimberly: were there any attempts to grow tea on the island?
Yes, and I'm not meaning St Helena tea, because there is a plant called the St Helena tea. But yes, they tried everything, but it didn't work.
Yeah. Here's a question from Marinda: why the retainer walls? Why were there retainer walls?
Why were there retainer walls? To keep out anyone that wanted to come and kill the governor. It was a defensive wall, and it was an enormous wall, and it had great buttresses along the side to make sure that even if you had a battering ram, you'd have a hard job getting in to kill the governor. The governors are very sensitive of their security, and of course, as I say, it wasn't just the enslaved population who were brutally treated. It was the military. In fact, probably there were more military revolts than there were enslaved revolts. So it was a defense mechanism. It wasn't to create a warm wall for plants to go against, anything but.
Okay, that is actually, I had thought it was more for the plants, but clearly wrong. Lauren asks whether all the soil was indigenous or was it brought in perhaps with the Kew Gardener?
Was soil brought in?
Yeah, or was it indigenous?
Soil?
Mm-hmm.
No, the soil is what they had there. Okay. But the soil varied greatly, and of course changes. They started at one stage plant. The Victorians knew that trees and climate were related, and that you needed to plant trees. You wanted to conserve your water courses. But of course, what they're putting in are exotics or conifers. And that will change the whole nature of the the soil composition. And in any case, the area, those are the very steep hills. Some of the houses look as if they're just about to topple off the side of the hill. They're so steep. And the soil, Beatson tried agriculture, and they did grow potatoes. They grew it partly as food, but also because of this distilling, this dreadful spirit that gut rot stuff that they gave to the troops at one stage. So you could grow potatoes there. I don't know if we have anyone from North Antrim who could tell us about what sort of soil you can grow potatoes in.
Okay, I will keep going as there are lots and lots of questions. Were there endemic or native palms in St Helena? What are the palm species that we see in the old pictures?
No. They're all imports. There are ferns, and there are gorgeous ferns. They're beautiful ferns, but there are no palms. Look, there are the endemics. I just didn't have time to go into detail, and you need to get Prof. Cronk on to give a proper lecture on it. But if you look at the flora and at the different categories, you can break it up and you can see what thrives and what doesn't thrive. Obviously, the ferns there, the palms were all exotic. No, there was naturalized plants. In other words, plants that had made their way on their own without human endeavor that was here. And you must remember the size of the population. The population of St Helena today is 4,400 about. The population when Napoleon there was 8,000 about, but that was because there was a vast military garrison that was there. But even so, the population was greater. But the further back you go, the smaller and smaller the population goes. The story about the Fire of London and people, refugees in the Fire of London coming and being planters on the island and what have you. The smaller the population in the early days, obviously, the less, the farming will be and the less area. But of course, then you've got the goats destroying everything. And they try half-heartedly shooting out. They try to preserve some of the indigenous forests. There's the Great Wall of St Helena, believe it or not, a remnant of which is there, where they tried to put a wall around it. But, you know, you try to stop farmers cutting down a tree and getting some firewood, it wasn't going to work.
Here's a question from Andrea. Do you know what the vegetation would have been like in the arid areas before it was stripped?
Look, no. There would have been obviously lots of the endemic stuff, but to pretend that it was just an extension of the Midland areas is not so. It obviously was affected by the fact of the coastal being so close to the sea, the elevation, the nature of the soil there, and the ability to build up soil there. But there was a lot there, and to the extent there still is a lot. You know, there's this wonderful story of Prof. Kronk and Benjamin getting a rope and going down a cliff and discovering something that they had thought had been extinct for 100 years. You know, real John Buchan stuff in botany, in the botany world. But the point is, it was growing on a cliff edge there. And like that picture on the cover of the book, there were these plants growing there. It was just in more profusion and the greater variety. What there was that's gone and disappeared, I don't know. It's safe to say there are some stuff that is extinct that, you know, there wasn't recorded. There's bits and pieces, and there's bits and pieces in Oxford area, and there's bits and pieces in the Natural History Museum and at Kew. And there was occasionally, there's a Frenchman, Poirier, at the beginning of the century, a civilized sort of a chap, but he wasn't living in a very civilized place at the time, you know, who was interested in plants and sent plants back and what have you. But, you know, these are, first of all, you send back what is noticeable and what looks exotic and strange. And secondly, there's such a small volume of it that you can't really draw much in the way of conclusions from that.
Okay, let's see. There are so many questions. I kind of want to see if I can link them together, but I'll just go through them. You showed some lovely paintings. Is there any record of William Hodges painting pictures on the island? That's from Christine.
I don't know. I will make a note of that and try and find out. I'll put it on my Twitter. Hodges.
Yep, William Hodges.
Yeah, I must admit, my main interest was in well, apart from the actual gardens themselves, was in the botanical stuff and the people. Melis's wife did the plates in his big book, and they're very professional plates, and very much like a la Curtis's Botanical Magazine, and the man who made the lithographs was the brother of the man who did the lithographs for Curtis's Botanical Magazine, so they're top notch.
Right. Here's one from Gerald. Have you seen the ebony? I'm not going to say the species name. That he planted on Madeira Island in the 1990s, where it apparently still grows, and the plant came from Kew by Tresco.
But is it ebony? I mean, ebony is a word,
so
you know, and
Trochitropsis ebenis.
And the question is it the St Helena ebony?
Well, I don't know. He said it came from Kew and was planted on Madeira. Well, Gerald, I'll leave you to follow up later on that one.
Yeah.
Here's one. Are there mulberry trees still present since the silk industry didn't work out?
Yes, page 222 of the flora.
Excellent. And are there still wild goats?
You know, they say not, but when I was there last, a goat ran out in front of me. I was very tempted to try and run it down. Mind you, I wouldn't have caught the goat.
Here's one. Could you comment on the Duke of Wellington in St Helena?
Yeah, he stayed in the same house that Napoleon stayed in, and a lot of the officials not just the Duke of Wellington, but a lot of the people who called, like Raffles from Singapore, would call on St Helena on their way back. And then they'd go up to Longwood and demand an audience with the emperor. And the emperor, of course, didn't like it because basically he was in a zoo, and people were staring over the wall at him. So he very often refused to accept visitors. And remember, he was treated rather badly. He was allowed to go within a circle area during the days of light. He could go beyond if a British Army officer went with him, but he regarded that as an insult. But at night, they closed him into the house and the garden. He was allowed to walk in the garden at night. And they literally had, dozens of troops standing, on guard round the garden wall and the house wall to keep him in, because they were terrified. They were terrified that he'd do an elbow on them and slip off, which he would have, I think, if he could have, but it was rather unrealistic set out there. And remember that around St Helena, night and day, squadrons of the Royal Navy circled and circled and circled and circled for 5 years. An extraordinary story for one man. That he kept his, he was gravely ill for a lot of the period. He was with his courtiers who behaved most admirably, but you can't live in a small little house with 2 other families sort of neck by jaw and not get a bit irritable about it. That he kept his sanity was remarkable. He read, of course, and books came in. Lady Holland from London, sent him vast quantities of books, and in fact, the story about the daisy that the Australian daisy, that Napoleon's daisy, that the story comes that she allegedly, or we think she might have sent him the daisy to grow at Longwood, which she might have. She might have done that. He had a very routine time to his day, but a very formal time, and the garden was very much part and parcel of that. And the greatest pity is that they were just so ruthless that they just destroyed the thing. But it was partly because when the company, you see, you're dealing there at the end of the company's days. He dies in 1821. The company's out in the mid 1830s, so you're in the rundown. The company's going through a bad period, and some of the governors weren't up to it, and certainly later on, some of the governors, well, some of them were good. I mean, there was a man named Eliot who was a friend of Q's who did a lot of good work, but a lot of them, and the money, the governor's salary, what the governor got when the East India Company was there was a vast sum in relation to the pittance. They were getting tens of thousands under the company. When the Crown takes over, whoomp, it's down to about 7,000 or 5,000 or whatever it is. And how can a gentleman live off 5,000 a year?
So here's a question, actually, following up on that. Whether is the East India Company in its present form, which I actually only found out about, some of my lab members were talking about this a few days ago, is it still involved in St Helena?
Well, no. I mean, St Helena becomes a crown colony whenever it is 1836 or whatever, and just as like any other crown colony at that stage, the company's out of it. Then, if you mean is it has it anything to do with the running of it? The answer is no.
Oh, I actually think they meant more like perhaps in tourism or things like that. And recently, right? So the East India Company was revived, I think, just a decade or two ago.
Yeah, but
no, very different.
Yeah,
sounds like a no.
Sorry, Anjali, Gerald has replied about it is the St Helena ebony for the previous question. And
is it?
Just look at the last. It is the St Helena ebony, yeah, that is asking about.
Okay. Oh, it was found by Kew botanists hanging off of a cliff out of harm's way from the goats. Since it was previously thought to be extinct, he'd like to know if it is still growing on the island today.
Okay.
Sounds like we don't know, as there's an open question there. Here's a talk from Bricken, who I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, who is the chair of our audit committee. So thank you again, Bricken, for that. And he says thanks for a great talk. as well as government and private land, were there church gardens?
Well, that's a lovely question. Were there church gardens? Well, there were very few churches for a start. I'd be happier talking about cemetery gardens than I would about church gardens. No, there was a little gardenette thing at the rectory in the country church. That's the one that serviced the Plantation house. But there were nice trees in the old cemeteries. That they've gone now. They were swept away, various floods. And I have a wonderful photograph I actually bought in Paris of one of the cemeteries with the governor's tomb there, and the wall is broken because the flood had come in and built up and then crushed through and broke its way into the street. And you can see the old trees that were growing there. So yes, in that sense, there were the cemetery gardens, and of course the mausoleum garden where the body was kept, where he was entombed, was kept as a garden. And quite an attractive garden it was, and still is to an extent. Though I noticed there are fewer trees and the types of trees than there were in the 19th century.
Okay. On the topic of kind of natural disasters, following up on your flood comments, there's a question about whether there was a volcanic eruption fairly recently.
No, you're thinking of Christen da Cunha, the other island, the sister island in the South Atlantic. There's Ascension, St Helena, and Christen da Cunha, and Christen da Cunha is the one where there was, and they were evacuated, a lot of them to St Helena, but they went back, they went home. They're still down there.
Okay. There's another follow-up on the ebony question from Ray, where he says he understands there are 4 St Helena ebony species, one of which is extinct. And also the St Helena olive is also extinct. I don't know if you know about those ones in particular.
Yeah, you've got these. Well, I read it out at first. You've got these categories of what is extinct and what's extinct in the wild. Let me just see here. There are 6 categories, both cultivation and the wild. They are the St Helena ebony tree, the St Helena heliotrope, the stringwood, Burchell's bellflower, Wallenbergia burchellii, the St Helena olive. Now those are the ones that are extinct. Then there are the ones that are extinct in the wild, such as the St Helena redwood and the she cabbage tree. So there are 8 that fall into the categories. Yeah. Look, they're a very small number in relation to the total number of, I say it's an international botanic gardens, the island, when you look at the whole flora, but naturally the conservation, and Kew is doing an awful lot of work on it. Dr. Clubb is the chap in charge there of the section, but the trouble with re-establishing things is, in fact, when I came back to St Helena the second visit, I thought in actual fact things had gone backwards from what they'd been in 2006. The trouble is you put in plants and it's in the middle, it's surrounded by New Zealand flax, and you start cutting the flax away. Well, unless you replace it, you're going to get invasives coming in there. It will push out the indigenous stuff. We have this problem here in KZN as well.
Actually, everywhere, really, isn't it? An issue. Okay, well, normally, if we were in person in the library in the meeting room, I would have ended this quite a while ago, so we could retire to the library for a glass of wine. So thank you for allowing us to pepper you.
That's a very civilized thing. I just say one thing. When William Curtis of Curtis's Botanical Magazine was an old man, he said that there were 2 books that he felt he was proud of. One was his London Florence, his Flora Londonensis, and the other one was the Botanical Magazine. And he said the Floriensis gave him prestige, but the Botanical Magazine gave him puddings. And it's my hope and belief that people will rush out in great numbers and buy this book, so Mrs. McCracken and I can have lots of Marks and Spencer's puddings.
Excellent. I was actually going to let you have one more question, but this one's actually nothing to do with St. Helena. But Naomi Caligaro asked if you could comment on rose bushes, please, China to Calcutta, and whether some ended up in Ireland. So I think that's an appropriate final question for the night. So.
Well, I mean, I did a book called Gardens of Empire years ago in the early 90s, and I wrote a lot about rose gardens and botanic gardens then. I don't know. I must admit I can't remember finding roses in St Helena. I'm sure there were the odd rose plant, but it wasn't a big thing. Yeah.
She was asking about Ireland, actually, whether some
in Ireland.
Yeah.
Oh yes, no. Ireland grows the best roses in the world, especially in the north of Ireland.
Okay, well there you go. There's best roses in the world. It's a great way to end the evening. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us tonight. A fascinating talk. You can see just by we had a huge number of attendees and obviously tons of great questions. So thanks to all of you for attending.